thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. It's been great. I expected to be seeing all of you in person, and it's such a strange event that you're doing, and you've done a beautiful job to put it all together. So I really want to thank you for all the hard work that went into this. I think this is a particularly interesting thing to be talking about today, the subject of my book about Mr. and Mrs. Prince, just because of what's been happening in the country right now. To be able to think about a different way of looking at the history and the place where we all are living right now, the things that have happened in the past that maybe people don't know about, and to give us another thought about the way that they helped shape the country that we live in now. I wanted to give you an overview of the book, but it's about two people who were married in the 18th century. He was roughly contemporaneous with Benjamin Franklin. They were enslaved in Deerfield, and they got their freedom and went on to do some pretty incredible things. I started to think about writing this book when I was living in Gulford, Vermont, and they had 250 years before me lived in the same little area right over the mountain from where my house was. And I thought, what an interesting story about people who got themselves out of slavery and moved to Vermont, owned 100 acres, and then went on to have court cases. So we really want to think about what we might have thought about enslavement in New England early on, and how this story changes the whole view we might have had of sort of the view I had as a child, which was Johnny Tremaine and Paul Revere and all of those people. But there were some other people who were pretty important and interesting as well. I'm going to talk about just how the search got started, but I wanted to say a couple of interesting things that happened in the research journey. First of all, I thought it was going to take me a year. I had a grant from the NEH, and I thought, oh, great, I'll write a book in a year. It ended up taking 7 years, and I ended up writing it 5 times, something I tell my students all the time, which is revision, revision, revision. And even if you don't want to revise, somebody else might tell you to. So I had to revise it a whole lot. I thought I had finished it, and I hadn't. The research was quite incredible, because we think of research as being computer oriented, but in fact, what do you do when you're writing about people who have no letters, no journals, no photographs, no art? I was used to writing books about people where I had boxes and boxes of letters, and suddenly I was writing about people I didn't even know what they looked like. I didn't know what they sounded like, and I couldn't do research in the normal way. So every little tiny clue came in sort of sideways. I was halfway through what I thought was my original research, and I was researching the family that had owned a Bijah Prince in Northfield. And I thought, well, okay, they came up from Wallingford, Connecticut. Bijah was brought up there as a small child, maybe 12 years old. How do I know about what happened to this family and how he got there, which really was at the back of Beyond when he was living there. And I started going through the names of the family, the Doolittle family that had brought him up there, that had been owned him. And I started seeing names that were really familiar, Todds and other people from Connecticut. My mother, who was a white genealogist, had done terrific research over many years. So I called her up and went down to her house, and I said, let's just look at the books you've got and let's see who these people are. And I was stunned to find out that I, in fact, was descended from the people who had owned Bijah Prince. People asked me later, oh, it must have been interesting to be a descendant of Bijah and Lucy. And I said, no, I'm not related to these people at all. I'm related to the people who had them in their house. But when I wrote the book, I thought, you know, it's like you're invited to dinner at somebody's house, and you get there and you sit down and you realize you're at the wrong house and the wrong table. And that's what it was like for me. So that really got things moving in a different direction. And the second thing that happened was my NEH grant ran out and I had to go back to work. So I asked my husband to join me in the research. He is not an academic. He has not done anything about enslavement. He is an Italian person who had been in marketing And he turned out to be such a terrific researcher that almost all the best finds were his, and I was extremely jealous. I have to say that working as a team was a terrific thing to do. It's a wonderful thing for two people to have a quest. So it became the story of a quest, and that's why I've called it Bijah and Lucy. I'm going to see if I can make these things work properly. Oops. Try to advance the slides here when I'm in screen share. I've never had to do it from the screen share before. Okay. And the story starts in a lot of it in Northfield, as we know, and Bijah was taken up there as a 12-year-old. He stayed there until he was an older man. He was in his 50s, and he was still enslaved. Northfield was still small. The Doolittle's family was huge. They lived in a small house that was added on to as time went on, and they had more children, they had soldiers, the French and Indian Wars were going on, and Bijah, of course, like other enslaved people in Western Mass, owned a gun, and he actually hunted, and he traveled, and he rode horseback, and he took care of people. So he had a lot of ability to move around, but he did not have the ability to be free. So in the age of 50 or so, 52, he decided that he needed to be free. And what he did was really quite remarkable. He managed to free himself. The first thing he did was join the army, and he got pay for being in the army. Normally, the pay would go to the person who owned that person, but he went to someone else who lived in Northfield, and he seems to have made an agreement that said, if you will arrange to buy me from the Doolittles, I will give you my pay from the army, and you can then write me a manumission. Bijah managed to get himself free. He did join the army, and then he did several small tours of duty. And then he, in the army, met Elijah Williams, who was famous in Deerfield. He was one of the well-known Williams family who were very well-known merchants on the Connecticut River Valley in the Pioneer Valley. And so he knew Elijah Williams, he worked for him, and then after he managed to get himself free, he actually moved with Williams and his family to Connecticut for a while, worked for him there, and Williams may have worked a little bit in his shop in Deerfield. So he managed to be a free man and to move around, and he is now at this point in his mid-50s. My husband, Anthony, and I used to do these research things together, and we could not figure out how he got free. We just couldn't sort it out at all. And we were finally doing research in Springfield, Massachusetts, and in the library, not in the library, it was in the place where they had contracts and things, but it was not about slavery. It was all about buying and selling property and that sort of thing, but not enslavement at all. And one night I came back from New York on the train in the pouring rain, and he met me at the train station and told me to drive. So I got behind the wheel, driving along, the rain's coming down, and he said, if you could find anything, what would it be? And I said, Lucy's diary, all these things that are impossible. And he started to read this document to me. It said, know all men by these presents that I, Aaron Burt of Northfield in the county of Hampshire and province of the Massachusetts Bay in New England, weaver, for sundry good considerations me hereunto moving, have manumitted, released, and forever discharged my Negro man servant or slave named Bijah, alias Prince, from any further service or servitude of any kind or nature whatsoever. And that was recorded on August of 1751. We had never seen such a document, and we'd never heard of this man, Aaron Burt. We had no idea who he was. And that's how we managed to piece together this story of him arranging with Aaron Burt to get his freedom. We had never seen a document quite like this, although this is a pretty standard manumission kind of letter. So all those people who had been telling us over the years that their ancestors had freed Bijah Prince, who were very excited and say, oh yes, in the 19th century, I have all the letters saying, oh yes, my great grandfather freed him. This was not true. So the story about Black agency becomes really important, to think that actually some Black people were doing some of this on their own with the cooperation of other people. Bijah, after he became free, started moving around. We used to call it his road trip. Because he went to Northampton, he started moving around, he started working for other people. He had some friends named Ralph Way, Amos Hull, and some others. He lived for a while with Amos Hull and his wife Bathsheba. And this picture of Agrippa Hull, who was the son of Amos and Bathsheba, became a well-known person who had a catering business in Stockbridge, and Agrippa Hull. So this is the only picture we found of a Black person who knew the princes. And I love to see this picture, because he's now an old man, but Bijah lived with him when he was young. He stayed with him for a while, and then they started having kids and the house got small, and he decided to move on. Bijah had been in Deerfield, though, quite a bit. And he used to shop there with Doolittle, so he was familiar in the town. And across the street in the town, oops, skipped one, was a house that had a Lucy Terry in it. So let's try to switch to Lucy Terry and figure out how they knew each other. Lucy was 25 years younger than Bijah, and she was living in Deerfield at the time. So let's figure out how she got there. This is a man named Hugh Hall. He was a Boston merchant. He was originally from Barbados, which was on the triangular trade route, and he had a shop in Faneuil Hall. His father had wanted him to be a minister, which he didn't want to do, but so he went into business instead. He had gone to Harvard, like many other people at the time, and he was very well connected. But he opened a business in Faneuil Hall, and he decided one day that he was going to put an ad in the paper. And from this ad, from the many ads he probably put in the paper, we found this. Several likely Negro men, women, boys, and girls, some of which arrived about a week ago, to be sold by Hugh Hall. So this was the first clue that we thought that he might be connected to Lucy, and we started finding other connections to him. He places this ad, and in his shop, a few days later, come a couple of friends of his from Harvard. One of them is a man named Samuel Terry, and the other is a man named Stephen Williams, who was a minister in Longmeadow, and he was the brother of Elijah Williams, who knew Bijah. So we saw in his account book that just at right that time that he sold a person, or we don't know if it's a person, but Samuel Terry paid him the exact amount that a young slave would cost. So we're pretty certain that this is the place, and this is how Lucy Terry got her name and how she got to our part of the state. How she later moved from Samuel Terry is a long story, but she did end up in Deerfield with Stephen Williams' brother. I don't know, some of you are, I'm sure all of you know the street in Deerfield, and the slavery on the street was surprising to people who don't really know about the history of Deerfield, which is that this is obviously not a photograph of her time, but it's pretty accurate to what it might have looked like when Lucy was brought there. She was probably sold when she was about 6 years old to Samuel Terry, so she arrived in Deerfield several years after that, not as a small child. And she ended up with a family named the Wells family, I'm sorry. And Ebenezer and Abigail Wells, who lived right on the street. But she was not alone. A lot of people thought she was kind of the Deerfield mascot. She was the only one. But in fact, this little map that you might not be able to see is one drawn by someone named Bob Gromer, who identified that there were 17 houses that had enslaved people in them on that street alone in Deerfield. And if you look at the map, you'll be really surprised. So Lucy was living in the house with the Wells family, and there was another man named Caesar also living in there. There were people across the street. There were Jenny and Cato who lived with the Ashleys. There was a man named Titus there. There was someone named Ishmael. And it goes on and on. So most of us who think of Deerfield as a kind of backwoods, kind of sophisticated place, that's true in a kind of rustic New England way. But at the same time, we have to remember that enslaved people were very much a part of all of this. We ran across in our research evidence that some ministers in certain small New England towns were taking up collections to buy an enslaved person for the ministry, that his congregation would buy for the minister, so that he would too have one. So it was not unusual for people to have one or two enslaved people in their households in ways that we wouldn't imagine at all. Their lives were not that good. Some were okay. Lucy was very articulate. She was very well liked and all of that. But there were others. Stephen Williams in Longmeadow, one of his enslaved people jumped down a well and killed himself. Another one ran off and then later died. So it was not a good life, even though they might seem to have more freedom than on a plantation. This is the Wellsthorne house, much as it would have looked in Lucy's time. And she grew up in this house after leaving the middle of Massachusetts and moving to Deerfield. And it was restored in the 60s, and there was an addition built. But the second half, if you look on the right-hand side, that's really pretty much what it would have looked like when Lucy arrived there and where she pretty much grew up. This is the master bed in the Wellsthorne house in the new addition, and it was built when Lucy was in her 20s. So this was a later addition to the house, and it's one you might go through now if you go visit the house. The fireplace where Lucy would have done much of the cooking, she might have slept in front of it in the winter, otherwise she might have slept in the attic. And people say that women often were killed in fire, and that was the second most common leading cause of death for women in that time. I'm not sure. Second leading after childbirth. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but we do know that Lucy was here. And I have to say, as somebody who's researching, it's a wonderful feeling to actually go into the place where they lived and where you can imagine her walking through. You can imagine her in this room, which was the room where the Wells family slept, where Abigail and her husband slept. They did spinning, and it later became a tavern where soldiers could come in and get a meal, or people who were working in town could come in and eat. And Lucy would wait on them and was very, very popular. She could tell stories. She was very lively, and people thought she was terrific. And here was a pantry where she and Abigail would put the pewter dishes after they wiped them down, or turn the cheeses that they were making. And here is where the little side door from the interior where that fireplace was, this is where she would go out into the garden and start to, there was a kitchen garden there. So many of you who know the story of Deerfield know that there were two big fights that things happened there. One was in 1705, and if you go, you can see the tomahawk door that's still on display there, where there was an attack. Some people who wrote the history of Lucy thought that the 1705 attack was the one that she wrote about in a poem, but obviously she wasn't yet born and this did not happen. And they thought that that meant she was about 130 when she died or something like that. So that was not the one we're talking about. But she did witness the results of what's called the bars fight. The bars were a field where a lot of the local people would go work in the field. They would hoe their corn and they would have a lookout. But there was an attack that day, and the people who were wounded or killed were carried back into town. And Lucy witnessed them coming back into town carrying the people who were wounded. And she wrote the most important evidence of that fight in something called the Bars Fight poem. And I'm going to read it to you so you can just see it's a kind of sing-songy ballad, and it's kind of typical of probably what she did as a poet. 1746, the Indians did an ambush lay, some very valiant men to slay, the names of whom I'll not leave out. Samuel Allen, like a hero fought, and though he was so brave and bold, his face no more shall we behold. Eleazar Hawks was killed outright before he had time to fight. Before he did, the Indian Sea was shot and killed immediately. Oliver Amsden, he was slain, which caused his friends much grief and pain. Samuel Amsden they found dead, not many rods off from his head. Adonijah Gillette, we do hear, did lose his life, which was so dear. John Sadler fled across the water, and so escaped the dreadful slaughter. Eunice Allen see the Indians coming and hoped to save herself by running, and had not her petticoats stopped her, the awful creatures had not cotched her and tommyhawked her on the head and left her on the ground for dead. Young Samuel Allen O'Lackaday was taken and carried to Canada. So the poem was not written down for 100 years after this, but it gives you a kind of roster of all the people who were hurt or killed or captured in that bars fight. I didn't know this until much later. Several years ago, I was giving a talk in New Hampshire, and a woman came up and told me that her grandmother had had to memorize this poem as a child, and it was meant to be memorized. That's why the ballad kind of sing-songy way of talking about it was done, because paper was expensive. We don't know about literacy, but this poem was remembered. The children remembered it. The school children remembered it. People taught it to their children years afterwards. I finally found the first printed version of it in about the late 19th century in the Springfield Republican. So we know that Lucy composed poems. We don't know whether or not she was able to write them down. So after Bijah was in town, and he must have put his eye on Lucy, and she must have had her eye on him, because he was a free man. He had his own life, and he asked her to marry him. And we know this because we found the recording of their marriage. Abijah Prince and Lucy Terry, servant to Ebenezer Wells, were married May 17, 1756, by Elijah Williams. So that we know Elijah married them. We think it was probably right in his house, right across the street from the Wells house, and that this was an important thing, that Bijah was well enough connected that they could get married by him. We don't know how Lucy got free. We think sometime after her marriage, but it does say that she's a servant at this point, and servant was the euphemistic term always used for enslaved people. So she was probably enslaved at the moment of their marriage, but not for that long afterwards. But it is important to notice that she was an enslaved person. So the family settled in Deerfield, and they stayed there for a while on some of Wells's property. He gave them a place to live. They built a house, and we found this map from the about 100 years later. And the interesting thing is, if you look on the bottom right, it says Abijah's Brook. Now that's where Bijah lived, but it's fascinating that it was important enough that the map makers put it on, named for him, and it was known for where the princes lived. We know that people started coming to their house, and that the kids would come over and listen to her talk, and that we know also that they had children. There is should be a recording. I may have skipped that. There is a list of the children's births, and we found that in the Greenfield Town Hall. And it says that their children were Caesar, born in 1757, Deruxa, 1758, Drusilla, 1760, Festus, 1763, Tatney, who was a boy, I didn't know that for a while, 1765, and Abijah Jr. in 1769. So the first question is, why were these births recorded? We don't know that for most people. Not everybody recorded their births. And what we think was that, and others have said this before us, that the Stamp Act was coming in, where it was going to cost money to have things recorded on paper, contracts, deeds, that sort of thing. But the other thing was, these were children who were born free, and that Bijah probably wanted it noted someplace that these were freeborn children. So now we know where their children were born and how many there were and what their names were. We also were able to find the medical records of Abijah Prince in one of the town clerk's offices. And it was so complicated because doctors at that time did not keep records of diagnoses or any of those things the way we do now. they were what they treated them with. So, and it was done in abbreviated Greek and Latin. So Anthony, my husband, had to go off to a medical library at a university in New York and sit down and go backwards from the abbreviated Greek and Latin, figure out what was prescribed, find a materia medica, and find out what those were used for. And then we were able to piece together some things. We know that Bijah probably dislocated his shoulder and was injured for quite a while. We're pretty certain that Lucy had had a terrible time in childbirth at one birth. And there's a big little gap in there between some of the births. And we think at a time when people had a baby every 2 years that she probably lost a child. And we were able to piece that together as well. We also know that they had accounts. And here's an account book with the local merchants. I think I have, if I go forward, I can give you the births. Yeah, there they are. So that was all recorded. And you can see the gap between 1760 and 1763. So they move, they leave Deerfield. We know from the account books that they were buying things that people don't normally buy if they aren't building, or and that there are gaps. So that we found out that there were huge gaps in what they were buying and when they were in town. How did they get to Gulford, Vermont? Well, we were able to find out that Elijah Williams, like many other people, was given as a gift 100 acres in Gulford. The governor was handing out plots of land willy-nilly, and the rules were you had to clear 5 acres in order to claim your property, to show that you were actually homesteading there. And often people would hire other people to do that clearing. You also, by the way, had to send to the governor, because it was still British at that point, long, tall pine trees, and they were used for masts on ships. So we're pretty certain that Bijah went up there, and out of all the plots, over 100 acres each, that Williams got, Bijah cleared his 5 acres for him. And we think this because all of the accounts in Deerfield stopped for a while in the summers, for several months, where he would have been up in Vermont, and we were able to figure this out. So I finally got I started a spreadsheet. I printed out a map of every single month from all of those years, and I had a spreadsheet of everything we could find about the princes, just from all this deep research. And I put into each month the dates when we had some record, something that was about the princes. And then I laid them out on the floor, and I could search the spreadsheet and found out where they were when. So they get up to Gulford. Elijah Williams probably gave them this 100 acres out of all the properties he'd been given. And you can see that this is their cellar hole, which we used to go sit in. It's actually private property, but I know the person who owns it in Northfield. But we would go up there and just want to see where they lived. You can see it's kind of rustic. You could see where the outbuildings were, the barn was. Across the street from them is another cellar hole by the Noyes family. And you can see how much more elegant this was. It was professionally done. They really worked hard at it. And so what we have are the princes living on one side of the street with their children who were still at home. Some of them had grown and left. And then across the road was this really elegant house. And these people in the house were from Stonington to Connecticut, which was a great slave owning place. They actually in Stonington had plantations where enslaved people grew food that was taken to the West Indies to feed other enslaved people. And the Noyes family came from those families. They move up to Vermont, get their property, and across the street from them is what this black family who'd formerly been enslaved. They did not like them at all. They were harassed. There were all sorts of problems that happened to the princes. They would sometimes hire people to harass them, and we found some evidence of that in the court records. Right here is the Houghton Tavern in Gulford, Vermont. It was on the corner down near the bend, near where we lived. And the Houghton Tavern used to be where the magistrates would have their sessions. So Bijah, like many Vermonters, made a lot of use of the courts. And we were just amazed to find out how often he would take people to court. And here's an elderly man at this point who was so determined to assert his rights. We found all of these court records, but Anthony found them in the Newfane courthouse. He went back to look at them all, and they had been stacked up like a maze. You had to walk through all the old court records. You open the boxes, and they had been tied up, each one, and with ribbons or string, and they had been eaten by mice, and it was the whole record of this whole area. He went back to see the records, and OSHA had condemned the courthouse, so he could not have access to them. And he took his, I think he took a page out of Bijah's book, and he demanded that these were public records, and he demanded access to them. So they finally arranged that he could go back. And we were just shocked to find out how many times this family took people to court. Other people did it too. You know, if you owed somebody 50 cents, you might take them to court. But we found out that, for instance, people had beaten up his young son and left him, and they took them to court. We found that they had tried to steal things from them, and they took them to court. We found that people who worked for them had been attacked by people that Noyes had hired, and they took them to court as well. So it was really quite a mystery to find out. There was this whole story about people protecting themselves at a time when you wouldn't expect it. What we didn't know, though, was whether or not the princes were literate. How do you find this out? Well, first of all, we see that in one contract that Bijah signed, back when he was becoming, freeing himself, and he got into the polls for Northfield, and they had put the thing for him to sign, and they had put an X for him. And he smudged it out and wrote his name in to prove that he could write his own name. Could they read and write, though, because they were separate skills at that time? Well, in all the account books in Deerfield, we would find him, and they were buying things that were amazing. He bought a pair of eyeglasses. He bought ink. Lucy bought paper. There were primers, so they were teaching their children how to read at home. And one wore out, and they bought another one. They had a secretary's guide, and that was a book that people would use that would teach you how to do everything from, how to prune a tree or graft something, or to how to write a contract, or how to write an indenture. If one of your people was going to be indentured for 7 years as a servant. And we realized that these were things that the only people who could read were having in their homes. So that was a great mystery to us. Here is a page of an account book we later found. And I have to say, this is the only thing that we ever held that we knew that had been in Bijah's hands. And it was his account book from Gulford. And we could see that he was very entrepreneurial, that he picked up things. He would go down to Leiden or one of the other towns and bring things back for people. He would rent out his oxen and a cart. And here he bought half a cake of chocolate. He bought a peck of beans, and he charged someone for damaging his ox yoke and damaging the brake. So we think that he was loaning things out. This is from 1782. We're not sure that Bijah himself wrote this because it's in pretty good handwriting, but we think it might be their daughter Drusilla, who had been working in some of the shops in Deerfield for quite a while. And she ended up moving back to Gulford with them after a long time. So we think that she might have acted as a secretary for them. We know that Caesar signed his name to this other note. He was the oldest son who had long moved away. He never lived in Gulford. And you can see that he spelled his name S-E-C-E-R, Prince. But he signed this contract that this was a receipt. Here is a picture of Packer Corners. I don't know if you know Gulford at all, but Packer Corners was on the road toward Leiden, Massachusetts. And it was actually in the 70s, a place where a commune had been. And I remember being in college then when there was a fire that broke out and a lot of people were killed. It was a terrible thing. But this is not obviously in the Prince's time, this photograph, but it is the tavern. And we think that the people who were hired by John Noyes decided to leave from this tavern and attack the princes. It was a terrible thing. They got to the prince's house. They tried to break in. The princes at this point are quite old. Bijah is quite elderly. Lucy's a lot younger, but she's older as well. They had a mixed race hired man who worked for them, and he tried to protect them, and they beat him up, but they managed to get the door locked. Then the people went out and burned their hay ricks, and that meant no food for their animals, no hay for their horses and their cattle, and it was a terrible thing. So Lucy did something quite incredible, which was to take, not surprisingly, to court. She went up to Norwich, Vermont, and she waited for 3 days to make an appearance before the governor and council. This may be what people said was her arguing the case for the Supreme Court. We'll get to that in a minute. But she goes up there, she finally gets to them, and she's able to argue her case for protection from these people. And she returns home with basically an order of protection, a restraining order. And she comes back to Gulford, and they live out Bijah's life there. Bijah died, here is the record in the Gulford Church in 1794 at the age of 88 years old. So people could live for quite a long time. But Lucy, her sons come back, or the older ones, Festus and Caesar. They decide to move her to another property that Bijah had been given by the governor decades before, and that's in Sunderland, Vermont. They pack everything up, they start to do a probate, and then they head off to this property to build a house and to settle there instead, because obviously they don't much want to live across the street from the noises anymore. And they get to Sunderland, and this is probably where the property was, in Sunderland, Vermont, which was described as a quote, paradise where nature has poured out every beauty. They get there thinking they're finally going to settle in, everything's going to be fine, and they discovered that this man, Eli Brownson, owned the property, and he had owned it for decades, and that Bijah never knew. We discovered, it's a long story, but there had been a swindle where people were putting in claims for property and then putting people's names on it. Bijah signed up for his property and never was told otherwise. And when they got there, discovered that the people had then put little ads. They were supposed to put ads in the paper to say, if you don't vote or if you don't sign something, you're going to lose this property. Well, he was never alerted. It was never put in the paper. And they basically had put a lot of people's property on the market. And Bijah's property was one of them. Eli Brownson's family had bought it. So Lucy, Festus, Caesar, Drusilla, and Deruxa arrived there, and Bijah Jr., and discover, actually Bijah Jr. had died. He married and died. And discovered that this man owned this property. So what do? Knowing the princes, they take them to court, and they go through the town records. The town records are fascinating. They're in the back of a little addition to a house. I mean, it's very rustic. The town clerk owns the house. The records are in the back. I had read them over and over, could not find anything, could not figure out what happened. And then finally, Anthony says, you know what, there's no reason to assume that everything is written in chronological order. The town, you know, they don't have a lot of paper. How do you know? So he kind of flips the book to the back, and suddenly there are 8 pages of all the town meetings and the court cases. And there it is. All the appearances, all the arguments. People tried to argue, well, they shouldn't get any money back. Well, maybe we do owe them because their property was stolen. Maybe these people, the Wells family back in Deerfield, maybe they still have to be responsible for these people. Well, first of all, the Wells family was long dead. And secondly, there was no way that Lucy, as an elderly woman, was going back. We don't know how the court case was going because we couldn't find the court case. And then one day we were in an annex to the UVM library it was about 20 minutes before they were going to close for the day. They had specially let us in, going through unmarked boxes, and out of nowhere we find this page. And it is the lawyer for Eli Brownson. And the lawyer wrote every day that there was a court appearance, every court that it was with meeting, and who argued when. And the one thing that was really fascinating to us was there was one day where there was a court appearance and an argument, and he said, I did not argue that day. And we think that that could be the day that Lucy stood up and argued her case in front of the court. We see from the records that Caesar and Festus, her sons, took the case to court. So they were the ones who were trying to get the property back. And now we know when it all happened. We also know that these were traveling and circuit in other courts. So we do know that contrary to what people thought and all the legends that are on the internet, Lucy did not go to the Supreme Court of the United States, which was not meeting at that time. But we were so thrilled to find this notebook. So the town decides they have to support them. Festus is now married. He's married a white woman, also named Lucy, and he and his children start to come and to live with them. If you look in the very center of this picture, this is a town, the property map and the plats for the houses and the properties. Number 42B, right in the center, has the word Negro written in it. And that's the place where they built them, or let them build, a small house where Lucy and her family could live out their days. Festus died, and his wife, this white woman, and their children move into the Negro House, and they appear on the records as the white Negroes, which I found interesting. And so there they are in the permanent records of the town. We found that people in the town actually embraced them. Lucy, we found out, was pretty much blind toward the end. She, however, had memorized the Bible. I think that meant the New Testament. She had memorized it and could recite it. She had people come to her house to listen to her tell stories. That she was very honored. Every year the town had to help because Caesar is now quite an elderly man himself. So they gave them firewood every year. They gave Lucy and her daughters each a dress every year because people didn't have many of them in those days. So everybody got a new one once a year. They got a new dress. We know that Drusilla, the daughter, was a poet, and that people used to come and hear her talk about poetry too. We suspect there were things written down, but then after everybody had died, we think those were just destroyed. We don't know what happened to them. We know that in the town, Caesar was listed as a handyman. And there was a really fascinating story that we discovered toward the end, which was Deruxa. Now, she's the daughter who was the mystery. Somewhere in puberty, she became what the records called a lunatic. We have no idea what this means, but she apparently, something happened. We don't know if it was hormonal, but anyway, she became, she was not quite right in her mind. And then we found a newspaper account in the early 1800s that said, amazing occurrence. And it told the story of Deruxa, who, after all of these years, and she's now probably in her 60s, after all of these years of being a so-called lunatic, suddenly snaps back. She comes back into her right mind. Everybody is excited. I mean, Caesar at this point, this is later, probably after Lucy's death, Caesar and his sister, you can just imagine what it's like. They start saying, oh, you don't know. All these things have happened in the last 50 years while you've been out of it. Mom and dad lost their property. They took people to court. We got this house. Here's we are. And she got up. She walked around the house 3 times, came back in and laid down and died. And it was just the most amazing story. Lucy herself had died in 1821. She was nearly 100 years old. And in Manchester, Vermont, was the Reverend Lemuel Haynes. He was a mixed race minister. He was very popular. He later moved to New York. There's a whole story about him. But he delivered her eulogy. There's only one other, this is the only other picture I think of a Black person we knew who knew the princes. But he was very prominent, and he delivered this funeral for her. Her daughter-in-law stayed in the house with the children. She was very poor, and we found her in the poorhouse a few times and with the kids. The kids disappear And of course, we know we could follow some of them. They had a daughter and two sons. One daughter, daughters disappear from the records. They get married, their names change, people don't keep records, so we've lost her. The two sons, we were able to track one of them in the Civil War. So really, and another one too. And then some other genealogists who've been following the Prince story have kind of found them. We think that one of them lived, his descendants, in Eastern New York, right over the border from, near Bennington. So what do we know? They disappear. We don't know about great-grandchildren. We have no idea what happened to them. And it's always the question people say, where are their descendants? They were mixed race. We think they may well had, we thought they may well have married white people themselves and then kind of blended into the population over the next 100 years or so. But then the one that we found, the genealogist in Greenwich, New York found, was actually African-American. And so the story, and he served in the Civil War. So the story actually begins in the French and Indian Wars with the princes, and it goes almost all the way up to the Civil War. It's just an amazing thing to think of one family's story that spans all of these formative parts of the American history and how much they contributed to it. Both sons fought in the Revolutionary War. Bijah fought in the French and Indian Wars. We have really an American story at its most interesting. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of things. Charles Jacob, he later came to own the Gulford land. He was a German immigrant, and his family is pretty certain that he accidentally, or didn't care, or didn't know, plowed under Bijah's grave. So we can't find Bijah's grave. We don't know where Lucy was buried, so we can't find her grave. We do know from his descendants that Lucy and Bijah were considered really important people in Gulford. People loved them, and they would drive them by on horseback and say, this is where the princes lived. They were incredible people, and they told their children. And now it is Abijah Prince Road. School groups go there. The sign keeps getting stolen, and they have to keep putting it up again, which they can't afford to keep replacing. I, of course, had to have my picture taken underneath the sign to prove I had been there. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with this little poem, and then we can open it up to Q&A. Is that right? This is a poem that was written by a Goddard professor named Gail Jackson. And we know the premise of this poem is that we know one of the stories about Lucy was that she, every year after she moved to Sunderland, she rode on horseback back to Gulford to visit Bijah's grave every year. Okay, so the poem is Lucy Terry Prince, 1724 to 1821, August. Now she appears, an old woman, cresting a mountain on horseback, the horizon at the summit familiar as the climb, but at her age she considers it will not be many more times back and forth, twice a year to his grave, and the town where parts of their stories rest, not in peace, but at least on their own ground. August was the 25th, 1746. What they'd remember was their own history rhymed on the lips of a stolen child, bearing her slaved treasure, her own polished pain, hiding a gift in her mouth, storyteller, troublemaker, Caesar, Drusilla, Tatnay, Jeruxa, Abijah Jr. Marriage bought her out, and those children were more to fight for. Two of the boys in the war, girl losing her mind in poems. What they'd remember was their own. She'd remember hers. The names of whom I'll not leave out. The wind runs with her, its mane tossing round each name, and Bijah's brook winks water in sight of her property. A tune in her head, a voice on the mind of her memory, all gone over her shoulder, over green mountains, over and over since that day, in a net, without her mother, without her father, since that ship, since she'd stood and stood again to stand, Lord knows, it's a long way from where she started. Thank you. So I think we have
Yep, thanks so much, Dr. Gerzina. And we're going to use the chat the Q and A at the bottom of people's screens. So if you want to ask a question, please type it in there. And oh, yep, you have your first one. So you can answer them directly. You're muted.
I tell other people that all the time. Sorry. Bijah and Abijah. It's not Ajubaya. It's Abijah and Bijah. So it's just that people called him Bijah. His name was Abijah, and it was a biblical name. So it's not a difference in the first name. So I don't know if I misspelled or if it's someplace else differently, but I've never seen the name of Ajubaya.
I actually had a question. And in the Greenfield Recorder, they had a display ad from Deerfield in celebration of Juneteenth, and had portraits of all the African Americans who lived in Deerfield. I was wondering if you thought that this was what you thought about it at this historical moment.
Well, first of all, the people in the 1750s, there are no images of them. That picture of Lucy is someone that somebody hired someone to draw a picture in case to try to imagine what she might have looked like. But I'm so glad that the Recorder did an article like that to make people realize that things like Black Lives Matter go a long way back, and that we have to recognize that people who lived there, not just Lucy, because she made her way into the history books, but all the other people who died and are buried there, we don't know where their graves are. We don't know what they were marked as. So I think it's really important for us to think about this long history going back before America was even a country. And of course, that includes Native Americans, and some of whom were friends of Bijah and Lucy's as well. So, well, you're welcome, Barbara. DNA, I don't know how to find, how to use DNA if we don't have any bodies to take original DNA from. I do think that DNA is changing the way genealogy is done now, that things are being discovered about histories. I had mine done way before Ancestry and all of those, because I was living in England and somebody was very curious, and it was much more rudimentary, but he found, for instance, that there was some gene that was Native American. And I said, oh, well, I didn't know. And I asked my mother, and she said, oh, no, there were no Native Americans in our family. And I said, well, somebody didn't tell somebody something, because they're in my DNA. How did I become interested in Lucy and Bijah? I got interested because I had known about Lucy, but I hadn't known about Bijah. Lucy's Bars Fight poem is often the first one that is in the anthologies of African American literature. You find it a lot very early on, recorded that way. So I knew about Lucy, and then I knew this legend that she had gone and argued a case in front of the US Supreme Court, which of course wasn't a building in Washington, DC at that time. But in fact, it was not to be. But somehow when I was looking through just the town of Gulford, I realized that Bijah lived there, and his wife was Lucy, and it was Lucy Terry. So I thought, wow, this is just so fortuitous. I must have moved here to find these people. And so I decided to pursue it. And I have to say that when I wrote a proposal, my agent had 5 offers for the book. So people were really interested in this story. I actually was just thrilled to find out that Vermont had an African American history, and not just in Burlington. Let's see, I don't know if I'm getting a message that my call filter is almost going to be ending, and I don't know if that's the Zoom call, but just if I get cut off, I just want everybody to know I didn't let you go. The land he got in the division of land in Northfield, what about it? I'm not sure. The land, it was still there. It's still there. I know the person who lives next door. It is owned, um, maybe Paul could ask the question.
Oh, hi. I just want to say thank you so much. That was so great. Uh, and what you put out. And also just the idea that here we are living in all these towns, and does anybody really know what's gone on before? And have you tried to get this into the local schools? To me, this is one of the things when I was involved in education a lot. I used to think, you know, to really make the classes relevant, history, all these things could really be tapped into. Do you know that the street you walk down once, blah, 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 you know? Have you had any thought, or has anybody wanted to try to get this into some of the curriculums locally here?
I think some people have done that. I'm not sure how they did it. I do know that in Vermont, because they live in both places, that somebody approached a school teacher there and asked if they could learn more about early Black history in Vermont. And she said, well, there isn't any. And so that's when we realized it had to go into the schools and find a way to do that. I gave a lot of talks over the years at Vermont Humanities Council and around Western Mass and also in the Boston area. And there were often school teachers there. Somebody suggested that I write a graphic version, get a graphic novel of it, because they had done the same thing in England about slavery in Scotland. And apparently it became a huge success. So I think that might be the way to go, to get a kind of graphic novel of their story. I think I know of an artist who would be good, but I don't even know how to start with that. But I think it's a terrific idea.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I don't think, are there any other questions? I think we have kind of answered them.
I think Dawn has one about the land in Northfield. Did you?
How did they get it? I wasn't quite sure. Did it mean how did they get it or what happened to it? It remained in the family of Charles Jacob, and it remains in that family, and they live in Northfield.
And Lindsay asks how you became interested in them to begin with.
Yeah, I did answer that, I thought.
Okay.
Yeah, I just was so excited to buy them that I thought, why not? I did think, because the Historical Society was down the street from my house, and I went in and I said, I'm going to just write from all their notes. And it turned out to be a single file folder of newspaper clippings from, town reunions in the 20th century. This kind of research is not anything like any research I've ever done before, where you have to really go all over the way to find them. There are other stories I can tell. A couple of people said that they found them. They had seen them. Somebody saw Bijah sitting in a cherry tree, I think, in her backyard once. She said he was very tall. And so, yeah, I think there are sightings, but they are quite the local celebrities, even now. And I gave a talk in Gulford and one in Deerfield, and the interest in these people is just phenomenal. I think it would be just great if Deerfield could really get the plaques out talking about where the enslaved people live, especially in this particular historical moment.
And do you want to say a word about your new book coming out?
Oh yeah, I had a new book come out in April. It's with Liverpool University Press. I had done a 10-part BBC radio series on Britain's Black Past about people. I've done several books on Britain's Black Past, but this one was 18th century, and I had traveled every week to a different place in England and met with historians and went to sites where people had lived. And I decided later that it would be great to just get all those people together, each one write a chapter of this book. And they did. The BBC radio series is still available. If you search BBC and just put in BBC and Gerzina, you'll come to the series. And some of them were famous actors, they got musicians. It was a wonderful series. It wasn't just talking heads. It was actually one of those really professionally produced BBC radio things. So I felt very honored. So we made that into a book, and it's just come out now. Unfortunately, the lockdown came at the same time, so I'm not sure it's on Amazon because they couldn't get the books out of the warehouse from the press in. So Anyway, but yes, it is available, and it's a lovely book. I'm really excited about it. And now I'm stepping down as a dean, so I'm going to write my own book.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing some of Northfield's history with us. We'll all be looking out for the new book, and Amherst Books is stocking the ones that you've already written. So if people want to read this one, if they haven't already. So
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Mhm.